The morning fog clung to Kandahar airfield like cigarette smoke in a closed room. Captain Raven Nightshade Blackwood adjusted her flight suit collar, feeling the weight of something more than fabric against her neck. The briefing room buzzed with the usual pre-mission chatter, crude jokes, nervous energy, and the metallic taste of recycled air that every pilot knew by heart. She'd heard the whispers before she even walked in. The new transfer. The washout from some cushy stateside assignment. Another diversity, hire trying to play with the big boys. General Marcus Thornfield stood at the front of the room, his weathered face carved from 27 years of military precision. His eyes swept across the assembled pilots like a searchlight, pausing momentarily on each face before moving on. When they landed on Raven, she caught something, a flicker of confusion, maybe irritation. She was used to it. 5'6" in a world built for 6'2", quiet in a culture that rewarded the loudest voice in the room. "Gentlemen," Thornfield began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never had to repeat himself. "Today's mission parameters are classified at the highest levels. What I can tell you is this. We've lost contact with a forward reconnaissance unit operating in the Kunar province. Satellite imagery shows enemy movement converging on their last known position. Time is not our friend." The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of F-16s taking off from the parallel runway. Raven felt her pulse steady, the familiar calm that came before the storm. This was what she lived for, not the politics, not the proving herself over and over again, but the moment when everything else fell away and only the mission remained. "The terrain is hostile," Thornfield continued, pulling down a tactical map that looked like it had been drawn in blood and shadows. Mountain peaks at 12,000 feet, weather systems moving in from the northwest, and enemy SAM sites dotting the valley like Christmas trees. Visibility will be limited, and extraction windows are measured in minutes, not hours. Lieutenant Colonel James Razor Morrison leaned back in his chair, his trademark smirk already forming. "Sir, with respect, sounds like we need our best pilots on this one. Maybe the new blood should sit this dance out." His eyes found Raven's, and she saw the challenge there, the same one she'd been answering her entire career. The room erupted in low chuckles and knowing glances. Raven said nothing, her dark eyes fixed on the map, memorizing every contour line and elevation marker. She'd learned long ago that the best response to doubt was silence. Let the flying do the talking. Thornfield's gaze moved between Morrison and Raven like a pendulum measuring tension. "Captain Blackwood," he said finally, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone else shut up. "You're flying lead on this one." The silence that followed was different now, heavier, loaded with questions nobody dared ask. Morrison's smirk faltered. In the back of the room, someone coughed. Raven stood slowly, her movement deliberate and controlled, like a predator that had just caught the scent of prey. "Roger that, sir," she said, her voice steady as granite. "What's our timeline?" Thornfield checked his watch, a battered Casio that had survived more deployments than most soldiers. "Wheels up in 30 minutes. Weather window closes at 1400 hours. After that, those boys on the ground are on their own." The briefing room emptied quickly, pilots filing out with the practiced efficiency of men and women who knew that hesitation could mean the difference between coming home and becoming a statistic. Morrison lingered, his eyes still carrying that challenge, that assumption that she'd crack under pressure like so many others before her. Raven gathered her flight charts, her movements methodical and precise. She'd flown combat missions over 3 different theaters, logged more hours in hostile airspace than most of these hotshots had in total flight time, but none of that mattered here. Here, she was still the outsider, still the one who had to prove herself with every mission, every landing, every breath. "You sure you're ready for this, Nightshade?" Morrison's voice carried just enough concern to mask the condescension underneath. "This isn't some training exercise. Real bullets, real consequences." She looked up from her charts, her dark eyes meeting his with a steadiness that made him take a small step backward. "I've been ready since before you knew which end of a joystick to hold, Razor." Her voice was soft, almost conversational, but there was steel underneath, the kind of steel that had been forged in fire and tested under pressure. The walk to the flight line was a ritual she'd performed hundreds of times, but it never got old. The smell of jet fuel mixing with desert sand, the roar of engines spooling up, the organized chaos of ground crews moving with purpose around million-dollar machines of war. Her F-16 Fighting Falcon sat waiting, its gray skin gleaming dully under the harsh Afghan sun. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, her crew chief, was already running his pre-flight checklist with the devotion of a monk performing morning prayers. He'd been working aircraft longer than she'd been flying them, and his weathered hands moved over every surface with the confidence of someone who knew that his attention to detail was the difference between her coming home and her becoming a memory. "She's ready to hunt, Captain," Rodriguez said without looking up from his checklist. "Fuel's topped off, weapon systems are green across the board, and I've given her the full treatment, new tires, fresh oil, and a prayer to St. Joseph." He finally looked up, his dark eyes serious. "You bring her back in one piece, you hear me?" Raven nodded, understanding the weight behind his words. Rodriguez had seen too many pilots climb into cockpits and never climb out again. "Always do, Sergeant, always do." The pre-flight inspection was muscle memory now. External fuel tanks, weapons pylons, control surfaces, intake screens. Every pilot had their own ritual, their own way of communing with the machine that would either save their life or end it. Raven's was thorough and methodical, her hands tracing over every critical component like a doctor examining a patient. Morrison's F-16 sat on the adjacent hardstand, his crew chief already finished with the inspection. She could see him in the cockpit, running through his startup procedures with the casual confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. Part of her envied that certainty, but a larger part understood that doubt could be a pilot's best friend. It kept you sharp, kept you alive. "Nightshade, this is Tower," came the voice through her headset as she strapped herself into the cockpit. "Weather update shows storms moving in faster than predicted. Your window just got smaller." She keyed her mic. "Copy, Tower, how much smaller?" "Extraction window is now 1230 to 1300 hours. After that, you'll be flying blind through weather that'll make a hurricane look like a gentle breeze." Raven felt her jaw tighten. 30 minutes to find a recon team in some of the most hostile terrain on Earth, extract them under fire, and get home before the weather turned the mountains into a death trap. She'd faced worse odds, but not by much. "Razor 2-1, you copy that weather update," she transmitted on the tactical frequency. Morrison's voice came back casual, almost bored. "Roger, Nightshade. Just means we've got to fly a little faster, right?" She didn't respond immediately, her eyes scanning the instrument panel one final time. Every gauge was in the green, every system showing ready. But something nagged at her, a feeling she'd learned never to ignore. Combat pilots called it different things. Intuition, gut feeling, the voice that whispered when something wasn't right. Raven called it survival. "Tower, Nightshade flight requesting immediate departure clearance." "Cleared for takeoff, runway 27, good hunting." The twin afterburners of her F-16 roared to life, pushing her back into the ejection seat with the familiar embrace of G-forces. The runway rushed past in a blur of concrete and painted lines, and then she was airborne, climbing into the thin mountain air with Morrison's aircraft tucked into perfect formation off her right wing. Below them, Afghanistan spread out like a topographical map drawn in shades of brown and gray. The Hindu Kush Mountains rose ahead like the spine of some sleeping giant, their peaks shrouded in clouds that promised turbulence and zero visibility. Somewhere in those mountains, American soldiers were counting down the minutes until help arrived, or until it became too late for help to matter. "Nightshade, this is Overlord," came the voice of the AWACS controller, his calm professionalism a stark contrast to the chaos they were flying into. Be advised, we're tracking multiple hostile aircraft inbound to your area of operations. Estimate 6 to 8 fast movers, unknown type and intent. Raven felt her pulse quicken, but her voice remained steady. Overlord Nightshade, can you provide vectors and altitude? Negative, Nightshade. They're running silent, staying low in the valleys. You'll be eyes on before we can track them. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio. Nightshade, maybe we should call for backup. This is starting to sound like more than a simple extraction. She banked left, following the GPS coordinates toward the last known position of the recon team. The mountains were getting closer now, their peaks sharp enough to cut glass. Negative, Razor. Those soldiers on the ground don't have time for backup. We're their backup. The radio was quiet for a moment, filled only with the white noise of static and the constant hum of jet engines. When Morrison spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, less condescension, more genuine concern. Copy that lead. What's the plan? Raven checked her tactical display, watching the terrain roll past below them like a deadly puzzle. The recon team's last known position was in a valley so narrow it looked like a knife cut between two mountain faces. Getting in would be difficult. Getting out would be nearly impossible, especially under fire. We go in fast and low, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd done this before. Single pass, identify the LZ, then establish a combat air patrol while the rescue birds do their work. Simple and clean. And if those hostile aircraft decide to join the party? Raven's smile was cold as winter morning. Then we give them a party they'll never forget. The mountains rose around them now like the walls of a cathedral built for giants. The air was thinner here, making the engines work harder, making every control input more critical. One mistake at this altitude in this terrain, and there would be no second chances. Nightshade, this is Guardian 1-1, came a new voice over the radio, the pilot of the rescue helicopter that would extract the ground team. We're 15 minutes out from your position. How's it looking up there? Raven keyed her mic, her eyes constantly scanning the sky for threats. Guardian, Nightshade. So far so good, but expect company. Stay sharp and be ready to abort if this goes sideways. Copy that, Nightshade. We'll be standing by. The GPS coordinates were getting closer now. 5 miles out, then 4, then 3. The valley where the recon team was trapped opened up below them like a wound in the earth. Raven could see smoke rising from what looked like a crashed vehicle, and the telltale muzzle flashes of small arms fire sparkling like deadly stars against the brown landscape. Tally target area, she transmitted. I count multiple heat signatures in the rocks at grid reference 774218. Looks like our boys are pinned down pretty good. Morrison's aircraft banked to follow her lead, his voice tight with concentration. Confirmed. I see them too. Also seeing movement in the tree line to the north. Looks like we've got hostiles moving to flank them. Raven felt the familiar calm descend over her like a blanket. This was the moment when all the training, all the preparation, all the doubt in proving herself fell away. There were American soldiers on the ground who needed help, and she was the help they were getting. Razor, take high cover. I'm going down to mark targets for Guardian flight. Negative, Nightshade, too dangerous. That valley's a shooting gallery. She was already pushing the stick forward, diving toward the chaos below. Razor, you have your orders. Guardian 1-1, this is Nightshade. I'm making a low pass to mark enemy positions. Be ready to come in hot when I give you the all clear. The ground rushed up to meet her, the valley walls seeming to close in like the jaws of some mechanical trap. At 500 feet, she could see individual soldiers taking cover behind rocks and in shell craters. At 300 feet, she could see the enemy positions clearly. At least 24 fighters with automatic weapons, and what looked like a mortar team setting up on the northern ridge. Her targeting system locked onto the largest concentration of enemy forces. Guardian, Nightshade, target coordinates coming your way. Multiple hostiles in rocks at bearing 090 from the friendly position. Estimate 20 to 30 personnel with crew-served weapons. Copy Nightshade, we see your laser designation, coming in from the south. The rescue helicopter appeared over the southern ridge like an armored angel, its door gunners already laying down suppressing fire. But something was wrong. Raven could see it in the way the aircraft was flying, the slight wobble in its approach that meant they were taking fire. Guardian 1-1, you're taking hits from the ridge line. Brake left, brake left. The helicopter pilot's voice came back strained but professional. Copy, Nightshade. We're hit but still flying. Need you to suppress that ridge line before we can attempt extraction. Raven pulled back on the stick, climbing back to safe altitude, her mind racing through options. The enemy positions were too close to the friendly forces for her to use her missiles, and her cannon only had enough ammunition for one good strafing run. She needed to make it count. Razor, I need you to come down and help me suppress those positions. Coordinate your attack with mine. I'll take the northern slope, you take the southern approach. Morrison's voice came back hesitant. Nightshade, that's awful close to our guys down there. One mistake and we could hit friendlies. Then we don't make mistakes. Her voice carried a certainty that brooked no argument. On my mark, 3, 2, 1, mark. Both F-16s dove toward the valley floor like hunting hawks, their cannons chattering out streams of 20mm depth. Raven's rounds walked across the enemy positions with surgical precision, each burst carefully calculated to avoid the American positions below. She could see enemy fighters scattering, some falling, others diving for whatever cover they could find. Morrison's attack was equally precise, his rounds stitching across the southern approach and cutting off the enemy's escape route. For a moment, the valley was filled with the thunder of jet engines and the deadly whisper of cannon fire. Guardian 1-1, valley is suppressed. You are clear for extraction. The rescue helicopter dropped into the valley like a stone, its rotor wash kicking up clouds of dust and debris. Through her targeting system, Raven could see American soldiers running toward the aircraft, carrying wounded comrades and providing covering fire for each other. But something was moving on the eastern ridge, something that made her blood turn to ice water. Guardian, Sam launch from the eastern ridge. Break right, deploy flares. The surface-to-air missile streaked toward the helicopter like a finger of fire, its contrail marking a deadly arc across the blue sky. The helicopter pilot threw his aircraft into a desperate evasive maneuver, flares blooming behind him like deadly flowers. The missile missed by mere feet, exploding against the valley wall in a shower of rock and shrapnel. But there would be more. Raven could see the launcher reloading, the enemy crew working with the desperate efficiency of men who knew they had only moments before the American fighters found them. Razor, I've got Sam's sight on the eastern ridge, going in to suppress. Nightshade, wait, let me. But she was already diving, her aircraft screaming toward the missile site with the focused intensity of a bird of prey. The enemy crew saw her coming and tried to traverse their launcher to engage her, but she was moving too fast, flying too low. Her missile found its target with devastating precision, the explosion turning the SAM site into a crater of twisted metal and scattered debris. But as she pulled up from her attack run, her threat warning system began screaming. Nightshade, you've got multiple bandits converging on your position from the north. Count 6. No, 8 hostile aircraft inbound. Morrison's voice was tight with tension. Nightshade, we need to get out of here. Guardian has the ground team. We've done our job. Raven looked down at the rescue helicopter, now climbing slowly out of the valley with its precious cargo of American soldiers. They were safe, but barely, and those hostile aircraft were closing fast. Negative, Razor. Guardians still in the threat envelope. We maintain cover until they're clear. The first enemy aircraft appeared over the northern ridge like a shark fin cutting through water. A Soviet-era MiG-21, old but still deadly. Its pilot was good, using the terrain to mask his approach until he was almost within missile range. Raven turned into the threat, her training taking over like muscle memory. Bandits, multiple MiGs inbound from the north. Razor, take the trailer, I've got the leader. The dogfight that followed was a deadly ballet performed at supersonic speeds, with the mountains as an unforgiving stage. Raven's F-16 and the lead MiG twisted through the sky like dueling serpents, each pilot pushing their aircraft to the limits of physics and beyond. The MiG pilot was skilled, better than she'd expected. He used every trick in the book: barrel rolls, split-S maneuvers, vertical climbs that left vapor trails etched against the sky like signatures written in clouds. But Raven had something he didn't. She had desperation born of protecting others, and that made all the difference. Her missile found its mark, the MiG exploding in a fireball that lit up the mountain peaks like a second sun. But there were still 7 more, and Morrison was struggling with his own aerial dance of death. Nightshade, I'm in trouble here. This guy's good. She looked over to see Morrison's F-16 locked in a tight turn with another MiG, the two aircraft seemingly welded together by invisible bonds of physics and deadly intent. The enemy pilot was inside Morrison's turn radius, positioning for a killing shot. Without thinking, Raven dove toward the engagement, her aircraft screaming through the thin air like a missile itself. The MiG pilot never saw her coming. His attention was focused entirely on Morrison, on the kill that was seconds away. Her cannon burst was brief but decisive. The MiG came apart like a broken toy, its pilot never knowing what hit him. Morrison's aircraft pulled up and away, trailing smoke but still flying. Thanks, Nightshade, I owe you one. Just returning the favor, she replied, but her eyes were already scanning for the next threat. 6 MiGs left and her fuel was getting low. The radio crackled with the voice of the AWACS controller. Nightshade Flight, Guardian 11 is clear of the threat area. You are cleared to disengage. But as Raven turned toward home, she saw something that made her heart sink. 2 more SAM sites had been revealed on the ridgelines, their radar dishes turning like mechanical eyes searching for targets. And climbing toward them from the valley floor were the remaining MiGs, their pilots clearly planning to use the SAM coverage to trap the American fighters. Razor, we've got a problem. Multiple SAM sites active, and those MiGs are trying to push us into their engagement envelope. Morrison's voice was strained. Fuel's getting critical, Nightshade. We need to punch out of here. She looked at her own fuel gauge, critically low but not empty. Not yet. Negative. If we leave those SAM sites active, Guardian won't make it home. Neither will any other American aircraft that comes through this area. The decision was made before she consciously realized it. Raven turned her F-16 toward the nearest SAM site, diving through the defensive fire like a comet falling toward Earth. Her missile streaked out, its contrail drawing a line of fire across the sky. The explosion lit up the mountainside, but her threat warning system was screaming again. The remaining MiGs had caught her in the open, and they were closing fast. Nightshade, break left. You've got 2 bandits on your 6. She pulled her aircraft into a punishing turn, the G-forces trying to squeeze the consciousness from her brain. But the MiGs were closing, their pilots working together with the coordination of a well-trained team. Morrison appeared from nowhere, his F-16 diving out of the sun like an avenging angel. His missile found one of the pursuing MiGs, but the other was still there, still closing for the kill. The enemy pilot was good, very good. He stayed locked onto Raven's tail through every maneuver she tried, every desperate attempt to shake him loose. Her aircraft groaned under the stress of repeated high-G turns, the airframe protesting against forces it was never designed to withstand. And then, just when it seemed like the MiG pilot had her lined up for the killing shot, something unexpected happened. The enemy aircraft suddenly broke off its attack, climbing rapidly toward the clouds. "Nightshade, you seeing this?" Morrison's voice was confused. Raven looked around, trying to understand what had spooked the MiG pilot. And then she saw them, 4 F-22 Raptors dropping out of the clouds like gray ghosts, their stealth profiles making them nearly invisible until they were close enough to touch. "Nightshade Flight, this is Demon 11. Heard you could use some help." The cavalry had arrived, and the remaining MiGs scattered like leaves before a hurricane. The F-22s made short work of the fleeing aircraft, their advanced missiles reaching out across impossible distances to claim their targets. In minutes, the sky was clear except for the rising columns of smoke that marked where enemy aircraft had met their end. "Nightshade Demon 11, that was some fancy flying down there. Guardian Flight reports all personnel extracted safely. You can head home." Raven felt the tension drain from her shoulders like water from a broken dam. The mission was complete. The soldiers were safe. And somehow, against all odds, she and Morrison were still alive. The flight back to Kandahar was quiet, both pilots lost in their own thoughts about how close they'd come to not making it home. The mountains fell away behind them, giving way to the endless brown expanse of the Afghan desert. It wasn't until they were on final approach that Morrison's voice came over the radio again. "Nightshade, that was some of the best flying I've ever seen. Where'd you learn to handle an aircraft like that?" Raven smiled inside her helmet, but her voice remained professional. "Same place you did, Razor. Practice, training, and staying alive long enough to learn from your mistakes." The runway appeared ahead of them like a concrete lifeline, and Raven felt her F-16 settle onto the tarmac with the gentle kiss of a perfect landing. The mission was over, but something had changed. She could feel it in the way the ground crew looked at her, in the respectful nod from Morrison as he climbed out of his cockpit. But the real surprise was waiting in the debriefing room. General Thornfield stood at the front of the room as the pilots filed in, his weathered face unreadable. The mission had been successful, but Raven could see something different in his eyes, a calculating look that made her uncomfortable. "Gentlemen," he began, then paused, his eyes finding Raven's. "And lady, outstanding work today. Guardian Flight reports all personnel recovered with minimal casualties. The SAM sites have been neutralized, and enemy air activity in that sector has been eliminated." The room erupted in quiet congratulations and backslapping, but Thornfield wasn't finished. "Captain Blackwood," he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "A word." The room fell silent. Morrison shot her a look that could have meant anything, and the other pilots suddenly found their boots very interesting. Raven followed Thornfield out of the briefing room and down a corridor she'd never seen before. They stopped in front of a door marked with security warnings and classification levels that made her eyebrows rise. Thornfield swiped his card and gestured for her to enter. The room beyond was smaller than she'd expected, dominated by a conference table surrounded by chairs that had seen better days. But it wasn't the furniture that caught her attention. It was the man sitting at the far end of the table. He was older than Thornfield, his gray hair cut military short, his uniform bearing stars that indicated rank so high she'd never seen them outside of official photographs. But it was his eyes that held her attention, sharp, intelligent, and looking at her with an intensity that made her want to check her uniform for loose threads. "Captain Blackwood," Thornfield said formally, "I'd like you to meet General Hamilton Morrison." The name hit her like a physical blow. Morrison, as in Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, Razor. This was his father, the man whose name appeared on buildings and whose legend filled the pages of military aviation history. General Morrison stood, his movement careful and deliberate. "Captain, please sit down." Raven took the offered chair, her mind racing. She'd heard the stories about Hamilton Morrison, the youngest pilot ever to shoot down 5 enemy aircraft, the architect of modern air combat doctrine, the man who'd never lost a pilot under his command. "I've been watching your career with interest," Morrison continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never had to raise it to be heard. "Your instructors at Randolph spoke very highly of your abilities. Your squadron commanders have been unanimous in their praise, and today's performance was exceptional." Thornfield moved to a position behind Morrison's chair, his face still unreadable. "Captain, what I'm about to discuss with you is classified at the highest levels. Before we continue, I need to know, are you interested in doing more than just flying combat missions?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Raven felt her pulse quicken, but her voice remained steady. "Sir, I'm not sure I understand." Morrison leaned forward, his hands folded on the table like a poker player about to reveal his cards. "Captain, how much do you know about the test pilot school at Edwards?" The words hit her like lightning. Edwards Air Force Base was the holy grail of military aviation, the place where the envelope got pushed, where the impossible became routine, where pilots either became legends or became statistics. "Only what everyone knows, sir. It's where the best pilots test the most advanced aircraft in the world." "That's the public version," Morrison said with a slight smile. "The reality is somewhat more complex. We're developing aircraft that won't see public acknowledgement for another decade. Fighters that can do things that would seem like science fiction to most people, and we need pilots who can handle them." Thornfield spoke for the first time since the introductions. "The selection process is intensive. Most candidates wash out in the first week. Those who make it through the initial screening face 6 months of testing that pushes them beyond what they thought were their limits." Raven felt her mouth go dry. "Are you offering me a slot, sir?" Morrison's smile widened slightly. "I'm offering you a chance to earn a slot. Report to Edwards in 72 hours for evaluation. Pack light. If you make it through the first cut, everything you need will be provided." The room fell silent except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of aircraft taking off. Raven's mind raced through the implications. Edwards meant leaving Afghanistan, leaving the war, leaving everything she'd known for the past 3 years. But it also meant opportunity, beyond anything she'd ever imagined. "Sir, what about my current assignment?" Thornfield answered that one. "Already taken care of. As far as your squadron is concerned, you're being transferred to special duties. Your replacement arrives tomorrow." Morrison stood, signaling that the meeting was over. "Captain, I'll be honest with you. What we're asking you to do is dangerous. More dangerous than anything you've faced in combat. Some of the aircraft you'll be testing are so advanced that the margin for error is measured in microseconds. Others are so experimental that we're not entirely sure what they'll do when you push the throttles forward." He moved toward the door, then paused. "But if you succeed, if you prove yourself capable of handling what we're developing, you'll be flying aircraft that will change the nature of air combat forever. The choice is yours." After they left, Raven sat alone in the small room, staring at the blank wall and trying to process what had just happened. 3 hours ago, she'd been just another combat pilot trying to prove herself in a war that seemed to have no end. Now she was being offered a chance to join the most elite group of pilots in the world. The decision should have been easy. Any pilot with half a brain would jump at the chance to test fly experimental aircraft at Edwards. But something nagged at her, some instinct that whispered warnings she couldn't quite identify. She thought about Morrison, the younger Morrison, the one she'd saved during the dogfight. Was this offer connected to that? Some kind of payback from a grateful father? The idea made her stomach turn. She'd spent her entire career fighting against the perception that she'd gotten where she was through special treatment or quotas. But then she remembered the look in General Morrison's eyes, the calculating intelligence, the way he'd studied her like she was a problem to be solved. That wasn't the look of a grateful father. That was the look of someone who saw potential and wanted to harness it. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of paperwork, equipment turn-in, and hasty goodbyes. Morrison, Razor, sought her out the night before she left, finding her in the mess hall nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. "So it's true," he said, sliding into the seat across from her. "You're heading to Edwards." She looked up from her coffee, nodding the way he avoided her eyes. "News travels fast." "It does when your old man is making phone calls." He finally met her gaze, and she saw something there she hadn't expected, respect mixed with something that might have been envy. "Look, Nightshade, Raven, I want you to know what happened up there today." "Forget about it," she interrupted. "We were both doing our jobs." "No," he said firmly. "We weren't. I was showing off, trying to prove I belonged in the same sky as you. And when things went bad, you saved my ass. That's not doing a job, that's being a warrior." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was sure how to cross. Finally, Morrison stood, extending his hand. "Give 'em hell at Edwards. And if anyone asks why they picked you, tell them it's because you're the best goddamn pilot any of us have ever seen." The flight to Edwards took her over landscapes that shifted from desert brown to mountain green to California gold. As the transport aircraft began its descent, Raven caught her first glimpse of the legendary base, miles of runways stretching into the distance, hangars large enough to house aircraft carriers, and in the distance, the dry lake bed where so many aviation records had been set and broken. The base operations officer who met her at the aircraft was a colonel she didn't recognize, his uniform bearing patches from units she'd only heard whispered about in pilot-ready rooms. "Captain Blackwood, I'm Colonel Sarah Chen, Deputy Commander Test Pilot School. Welcome to Edwards." The name was familiar. Chen had been the first woman to break the sound barrier in an experimental fighter, and her reputation for pushing both aircraft and pilots to their limits was legendary. "Thank you, ma'am, reporting as ordered." Chen's smile was sharp as a knife edge. "Save the formality, Captain. Around here, we're more interested in what you can do than how well you salute. Your evaluation starts in 6 hours. I suggest you get some rest. You're going to need it." The quarters they assigned her were Spartan but comfortable, with a view of the flight line that showcased aircraft she'd only seen in classified briefings. Some she recognized, modified F-22s, experimental variants of the F-35. Others were completely alien, their shapes seeming to defy conventional understanding of aerodynamics. Sleep proved elusive. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the MiGs diving out of the sun, felt the G-forces trying to tear consciousness from her brain, heard the steady voice of the radio operator counting down the seconds until the extraction window closed. At 500 hours, her alarm clock seemed almost redundant. She'd been awake for the past hour, staring at the ceiling and trying to calm the nervous energy that had taken up residence in her chest like a caged animal. The evaluation began in a classroom that looked like something from a science fiction movie. The walls were covered with displays showing aircraft specifications, flight test data, and engineering diagrams that hurt her eyes to look at. The other candidates, 5 men and 2 women, looked like they'd been selected from the pages of a military recruiting poster. Colonel Chen stood at the front of the room, her presence commanding immediate attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to what we call the Crucible. Over the next 72 hours, you will be tested in ways you cannot imagine. Some of you will leave here, others will leave in pieces." She gestured to a display that showed a sleek aircraft unlike anything Raven had ever seen. Its lines seemed to flow like liquid mercury, and its engines were integrated so seamlessly into the fuselage that they appeared to be part of the aircraft's skin. "This is the YF-44 Phantom," Chen continued. It doesn't officially exist. The technology incorporated into this aircraft is 15 years ahead of anything currently in service. Its capabilities are classified so highly that the president himself doesn't have clearance to know all the details. One of the male candidates raised his hand. "Ma'am, what exactly?"